Alright guys, today I'm going to be walking you through my 4-piece striker SASG hybrid electronics DPS build. Now there's a reason I'm speccing both equally into firearms and electronics, but it's a very detailed reason. I'll try to articulate it as best as possible later in the video. But the basic gist of it is to increase survivability as well as increase damage more than I would be increasing it if I specced primarily into firearms. There's a lot of different reasons why electronics is superior to firearms, but again, I'll cover that later on in the video. Before I actually get started and talk about the meat of it though, I want to make sure that people know this is not to use and abuse the actual flinch that's on the shotguns right now. When you hit an enemy target, they actually flinch, and if they're aiming at you, their reticle or their marker jumps across the screen. No matter how that functions, if that gets down-tuned, which they are planning to do, they're going to reduce the actual flinch that shotguns have in PvP. If that gets down-tuned, this build will not suffer. It will still perform just as well, and that is not the main mechanic that's making this build strong. The main reason why this is strong is the extremely high damage output cap, the hybrid electronics for a variety of reasons, increasing damage further, and survivability, and the ability, again, to maintain stacks because of the SASG and jump from target to target while effectively dropping them quickly, maintaining those stacks, and then moving on to 1 or 2 shot players almost 100% of the time. Jumping into the gear, I'm going to cover both my high ends, then all my striker pieces, then my weapons, etc. But I'm going to do it as quickly as possible because there's a lot of other information going into the build that is behind the scenes that I feel is more important. So for the chest piece, you absolutely want health and skill haste. Health, pound for pound, is worth about 1,000 main stat of stamina here, and stamina is very weak in and of itself. You don't want to be rolling stamina anywhere if you can possibly help it. If you have to get some to unlock your gun talents, that's different. But once those have been unlocked, you don't want to spec into stamina. However, you do want health in the chest piece. Then you want skill haste. Because of your high electronics and your high skill power, you're going to be able to pop your skills more often, but they're also more powerful. So any additional skill haste that you can get is very, very valuable. And the basic ratio of the build that I've chosen to run with is 2 electronics pieces and 3 pieces of firearms gear. I've run all electronics gear mods to compensate for this, so it's essentially like I'm running 3 and 3. You can also swap this. If you don't want to run 2 pieces of electronics, you want to run 2 pieces of firearms, then run 3 pieces of electronics and run all firearms mods. Both will work fine. For the chest piece, for the final role that you want, for a minor attribute, you want ammo capacity. There's nothing else that's going to be best in slot there or better than this. But if it is something else, it's not going to make or break the build. Next up is our high-end backpack, and since I am hybriding and I do have a lot of firearms, I've chosen to run with this specialized backpack. There are other alternatives to this. You can run something like Inventive, but that is conditional versus unconditional skill power. Specialized is going to have 200% of your firearms and stamina added to skill power 100% of the time. It's not going to be a condition that you have full health or something similar. So I have chosen to run Specialized. That's the best in slot in my eyes with this build for increasing skill power enough to make your skills worthwhile. I have chosen to run skill power as a major attribute. If you want per fight survivability more, and you don't want to prioritize survivability overall on a consistent basis, and you want bursts of survivability where you can take down 1 agent at a time and out-tank them, then you can roll health here, but pound for pound, I think skill power is a lot better. It's an electronics piece. As a basic rule of thumb, you want to roll over 1250 in every category if you possibly can for all of your main stats, but that's just something to shoot for. And if you're primarily playing last stand like I am, then you won't really care because normalization will kick in and it doesn't matter what the roll is. For a minor attribute, I have ammo capacity, though a resistance would definitely not hurt. Next up, we have our striker's mask, and the rest of the gear pieces are actually pretty straightforward. The number one thing that you want is critical hit chance. This is very important. The build is far superior, but also very similar to the Critgunner build I had in 1.5, so I'll detail that later on, but critical hit chance is absolutely essential in the major attribute slot here. This is one of my firearms pieces, so go for as high a main stat roll as possible. And for minor attributes, if you want any utility in PvE, I would recommend damage to elites. However, in PvP, I would highly recommend a resistance. Moving on to the knee pads, it's important to roll health as a major attribute. Pound for pound, roughly equivalent to 1,000 main stat of stamina due to the 15-to-1 scaling that stamina has right now. So that's a very good roll. There's nothing else that's going to be better. And for minor attributes, you want to aim for burn resistance and shock resistance, especially in PvP. Outside of that, if you want to be using it in PvE, increased kill XP is going to be a great way to get increased proficiency catches, though I do personally believe that loot is way too abundant in its current state, so that's something that they really need to down tune. But anyways, that's probably going to open a whole different can of worms, and I'll do an entire video on that later on. Increased kill XP for PvE, for PvP, various resistances, and then health as a major attribute. Next up, we have our striker gloves, and on this piece of gear, we're going for the trifecta, the old trifecta. What that means is shotgun damage or main weapon damage of the gun of your choice. In this case, it is essential to run a shotgun. That is why it synergizes so well with the striker gear set. Critical hit chance and critical hit damage. These are very important. If you have a variation on this, it will decrease the efficiency of the build. Other than that, you want as high a main stat roll as possible. You can look at the native armor roll if you are going to be playing in the Dark Zone, if you're going to be playing PvE, but in Last Stand, due to normalization, it doesn't matter at all. Last up, we have our Striker holster. Extremely straightforward. You want the highest possible main stats, and then you want health as a major attribute. Though the argument can be made that skill haste does have utility here, so it's really user's preference. I've opted to run health. Moving on to my weapon, this is where things get really interesting. I'm using a black market SASG-12 for faster stacking of the Striker gear set. Now, I am using a 163 version of the gun. The gear score is 163. This is because that's the only blueprint that I had. But due to the hybrid nature of the build, you will still be able to activate the talents even if this is a 256 version of the gun. As you can see, the base damage is significantly lower on a 163 version. I have a different black market SASG-12 at 256 that has over 100,000 base damage, just for demonstrational purposes. And in normalization in Last Stand, this will kick in and the damage will increase to over 100,000. But as you can see, it's much higher, but you are a hybrid build. It doesn't matter what the talents are or where they are. There's a list of talents that are most effective in the build, which I'll go over in a second. You will activate all of them regardless of the gear score. So Fierce is going to be active even on a 256 version, and that's a very strong talent for the gun. That's unconditional crit hit chance, and crit is one of the strongest mechanics in the game of all time. It really was way back in the 1.1 days. Now especially, it's making a resurgence. It's extremely powerful, so I recommend Fierce or Adept, something similar, maybe even Vicious, but Vicious would have to be in the third slot. Now, as you can see here, Vicious is not active on my secondary gun because it requires a whole bunch of stamina, and you don't want to spec into stamina. So if you are having Vicious on a gun, I would recommend it in the third talent slot. Now, for this gun, Fierce, Responsive, and Competent. Now, Competent, it doesn't matter where it is on the gun, what talent slot it's in, it will always be active due to the hybrid nature of the build. Again, that's very powerful. And then switching that out for something like Adept is also very good. Increases crit when you're proccing a skill due to your increased skill haste on your gear, as well as the very high skill power comparatively to most DPS builds. And even for a hybrid, you know, it still has significantly higher skill power than a lot of different builds will have. Any on skill pop ability is going to be very, very powerful. So what I have here is Fierce, Responsive, Competent. I would consider that to be a god roll among many. If you switch out Vicious in the third slot, that's very good. Most of the time, you're going to be operating within an overheal. If you switch out Adept in any one of these slots, also very good. In my gear, I am running all electronics mods with skill haste to increase the frequency with which I can pop skills. And then for my performance mods, I've split it right down the middle with 2 first aid self-heal for 12% total, and then 2 different mods with pulse critical hit chance. This further increases damage by a huge amount, especially due to your high skill power for a variety of reasons, and I'll articulate that in just a couple minutes here. But it is important to note that you can switch these out, and you can run 4 first aid self-heal mods if you want increased survivability. For weapon mods, you want an extended magazine with crit hit chance and crit hit damage, and then you want as much critical hit damage as you can possibly get on the other 2 modification slots. Critical hit damage as a major here. If you can get critical hit chance as a minor on the optic, that is very good as well. But again, critical hit damage as a major in that slot. Before kicking it over to the skills, talents, and live gameplay, let's examine electronics versus firearms as main stats, starting with firearms. Now, what do you gain for a heavy investment into the firearms main stat? Well, you get a flat damage increase. Now, this can scale with progressive bonuses even better, so that's not very bad, but that's the only thing that you gain. So firearms, flat damage increase, checkmark, done. For electronics, the list is too long to even mention everything that you gain. You gain a larger amount of healing that you get from any heal skill that you choose to run, whether it be the support station, whether it be a personal self-heal like booster or overdose, etc. You gain increased damage from pulse. You gain increased crit chance and crit damage that your whole squad gets, so you increase your team utility. You get decreased global cooldowns. This includes your signature skill. You can pop your signature more often. You can pop your other skills more often, triggering things like Competent and or Adept more frequently. The bonuses never end. You can choose from a wide variety of skills on the fly in a given match. You don't actually have to rebuild your character, and you can take advantage of a very vast array of mechanics with high skill power to situationally overcome obstacles. So when it comes right down to it, in my eyes, skill power and electronics is vastly superior to firearms. And I have one specific mathematical example for you guys, but I'm not going to talk about all the different calculations that went into this build because they were, you know, numerous and they're actually very tedious. For my example calculation, let's assume a shotgun damage of 80,000. Let's assume that you have 50% crit chance, something that is very, very easily achievable with Pulse on this build, and 100% crit damage. Now, I've undershot these numbers. You can actually achieve 60% crit hit chance and meet the cap with this build, depending on the different talents that you have, depending on your different roles, whether or not you're in normalization, etc. And you can achieve well over 100% critical hit damage, somewhere upwards of 118, 120% on certain builds with certain characters. Now, assuming that it's 100% critical hit damage and 50% critical hit chance and 80,000 base shotgun damage, let's look at what that would deal in terms of each pellet. 80,000 damage would be broken down into different pellets. You have 8 pellets of 10,000 damage. And of those pellets, half of them, statistically, on a fully landed shot, would crit for double damage because you have 100% increased critical strike damage. Now, what this means is that 4 of the pellets, instead of 10,000 damage, are going to deal 20,000 damage, which means that you have 40,000 extra damage on top of the 80, bringing it to 120 on Pulse targets. Again, this is with Pulse active. What that means is that you have a 50% increase to the amount of sheet damage that you actually have, the amount of base weapon damage that you have on Pulse targets. Not to mention the fact that Tactical Scanner Pulse actually gives a bonus to the amount of damage that you're dealing, the base damage that you're dealing to Pulse targets, and the fact that you have Competent on the weapon, or could have Competent on the weapon if you build it the same way. All of these different bonuses mean that when you're popping Pulse and or Booster Shot, that's a whole different mechanic you can factor in, you're going to be gaining well over, 50 is basically the minimum, 50% damage on your build. This is theoretical. Again, these calculations don't apply specifically to the numbers on this build. The numbers on this build are actually very tedious to work with because none of them are exact. That's all hypothetical to make the calculation easier. But that's an example of one area where higher skill power and higher electronics can definitely compete with Firearms for the amount of damage that you're dealing. It drastically affects burst damage, and that is just one area. Survivability also goes up with electronics, a whole bunch of different areas, decreased global cooldowns, like I said before, and in my eyes, electronics is vastly superior to Firearms in pretty much every single way. Covering skills very quickly, the Tactical Scanner is what I would recommend for a Pulse modifier, and then Booster Shot is essential for your heal. You are running the Vigorous talent. This means you can receive an overheal, and because you do have some performance mods and high skill power that augment self-heal, your Booster Shot will heal for a significant portion, which is something that will keep you alive in a lot of encounters. That is something that you cannot switch out. Also, the base damage increase and the damage mitigation are very, very strong. For your Pulse, however, there is an element of choice. You can run Tactical Scanner for the base damage increase again, thus increasing burst even further. It also does have a significant amount of critical hit chance and critical hit damage, and it can be increased much, much further if you do augment your performance mods in a different way, such as more critical hit chance, sacrificing a little bit of survivability on the self-heal. But also a viable alternative is the Recon Pack. It has a significantly decreased cooldown. You can almost maintain a 100% uptime on the Competent talent on your gun if you do have high enough skill power because of the decreased cooldown, and then it also has increased critical hit chance. So if you want to be pulsing more enemies more often and having your Competent talent active almost 100% of the time, then the Recon Pack is for you. For talents, I recommend pretty much the same spread in every build now. However, it does vary a little bit based on squad versus individual play. If you are in a group, then I would recommend On the Move for self-survivability when you are getting kills on downed agents, and you will get a lot of kills with this build. I do recommend Triage if you do have squad mates. Again, any source of cooldown reduction is extremely powerful in the current meta state of the game. I would recommend Critical Save, even though it did receive a down tune in 1.6, it is still a huge amount of mitigation. It can keep you alive in a lot of situations. And then Strike Back. This is selfish, however, decreasing cooldowns, very effective for your build. Now, if you are also running in a squad, something like Combat Medic, you can switch that out at will for anything that you want, though I recommend keeping Critical Save. That's actually essential in my eyes. And if you are not running in a squad, you can switch out Triage for something like Tactical Advance. If you are, versed with using it, if you're used to running the Nimble talent or something like that, Attack Advance can be very strong. Or something else entirely, but it's really up to you. It's user's preference. Jumping into the gameplay, I wanted to show a little bit of the unedited process of how I stack up Striker and then use it to drop enemy agents. Now, the reason for this is because I am not necessarily the person with the best aim. I am able to use this build to devastating effect, even though my aim is, frankly, potato. It's a running joke in our live streams that I am not the person to showcase a lot of these things. It's all in good fun, but, the joke is kind of based on reality. I am not the one with the best aim. But this build doesn't really hinge on that. You know, you can time your shots, and because you have that increased survivability and you can drop enemy agents in about 2 trigger pulls a lot of the time, you're able to time your shots until you have the optimal encounter. You can operate within an overheal. You can receive an overheal from a lot of different abilities. You have a strong personal heal, and you have a huge amount of burst damage. As you can see here, I'm about to drop him in 2 body shots. Boom, he's done. Now that is a product of having pulse with increased critical hit chance, as well as increased critical hit damage. You can achieve upwards of 50-60% meeting crit hit chance cap with this build, with certain, you know, gun talent selections and certain mechanics at play. You have booster shot with increased damage. You have responsive with increased damage. You have tactical scanner on the pulse with increased base damage, as well as the crit. And then you have things like competent also proccing, as well as things like adept if you were to have it on the gun, etc. All of these mechanics synergizing mean that you have a huge, ridiculous amount of base damage. It's very easy to maintain the stacks, upwards of, you know, 50, 60, even 100% of the time, at 100% stacks from Striker. And when you want to, very frequently, because of your very high skill power, you can pop all of these snapshotted bonuses and then, you know, trigger an encounter where you can absolutely outdamage the enemy. This is going to perform no matter what. This doesn't rely on the flinching effect of the reticle jump that the SASG inflicts on enemy targets. It does not rely on that. Whether or not they downtune that won't make a difference in the amount of raw damage that you can deal. This build is phenomenal, and some people may consider it to be cheese or something that, you know, that they don't like fighting against, but I consider it to be counterable. I think that it's extremely strong, and it's possibly one of the highest burst damage mechanics or builds in the game right now. But it is counterable. If you draw them back, if you fight them at range, it's very easy to stop them. If you break line of sight, if you use a corner, use a grenade, you're going to be able to drop players using this build. And if you somehow, you know, disengage or space out your encounters, then you're not going to let them chain their stacks together. As you can see, as soon as you maintain high stacks, you can drop enemy agents faster than they can react. And that means that you can maintain those stacks. So if you are able to draw out an encounter, don't get close to a shotgun striker build. Don't get close, especially to a Critgunner build. If you can tell that they're hybrid, if they're operating within an overheal, if they're popping strong personal heals, then you're going to have to focus fire them. You're going to have to CC them. There are various different ways to do that. There are ways to win, but I thought I would put this build out there as it is an upgraded version of the Critgunner build from 1.5, and I do very much enjoy running it. Whether or not this SASG receives a down tune in terms of reticle flinch, it will still be just as strong. So that's going to wrap it up, guys. Thank you for bearing with me. It feels good to get back into the swing of the builds, etc. So definitely stay tuned if you're interested in that kind of stuff. Check out the links below if you want to support the channel. And as always, have a nice night.